The moment Alma Redmond drove the last nail into the fence post herself, 3 days after burying her husband, she understood that grief and capability were not mutually exclusive things. It was the spring of 1879 in Caldera County, New Mexico Territory, and the land around the Redmond homestead stretched wide and sun-bleached beneath a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at it. Alma had been 28 years old when she married Daniel Redmond, and she was 31 now, standing in the dirt with a hammer in her hand and sweat darkening the collar of her black mourning dress, and she did not cry. She had cried enough in the night since Daniel had been taken by a rattlesnake bite gone septic and fast. She had wept into her pillow until her eyes were swollen and her throat ached, and then she had risen before dawn each morning and done every single thing that needed doing because 40 acres and a small cattle operation waited for no one's grief. Daniel had been a good man. He had been a thoughtful man who kept his tools in precise order along the western wall of the barn, each implement hanging on its proper iron hook, spaced evenly. The handles all turned the same direction, so that any hand reaching in the dark could find what it needed. He had taught Alma this discipline himself during the first year of their marriage, when she had been inclined to set a thing down wherever she finished using it. He had shown her, patiently and without condescension, that a well-ordered barn was the foundation of a well-run homestead. She had laughed at him the first time he explained it. By the second year of their marriage she had understood him completely. After Daniel died, Alma kept every tool exactly as he had left it. Not out of some paralyzed devotion to his memory, not because she could not bear to change a single thing, but because he had been right and she knew it. The hammers hung by size, small to large, left to right. The saws occupied the center section, each blade wiped clean and lightly oiled before being set in its place. The chisels and awls lived in a fitted wooden rack that Daniel had made one winter from a split piece of cedar. The coils of rope were looped and hung with the tails tucked in so they would not tangle. Everything had a place. Everything was in its place. She ran the homestead with the same precision. She kept the cattle fed and moved, though the herd was small, only 11 head of mixed breed stock that she was slowly trying to bring up to something more profitable. She had a kitchen garden behind the house that produced more food than she could eat, and she traded the surplus in town at Pierce's General Store. She had 2 horses, a solid bay mare named Copper that Daniel had bought, and a younger gray gelding that she was still working with. She repaired her own fences. She hauled her own water when the pump needed work. She did all of it without complaint and without the expectation that anyone would notice. Because in 1879 in New Mexico Territory, a woman running a homestead alone was not particularly remarkable. Women had been doing hard things since the first wagon rolled west, and they had mostly done it without recognition. The one concession Alma made to her situation was that she accepted help from her neighbor, an older Mexican woman named Doña Esperanza Villanueva, who lived a mile east and who had outlived 2 husbands herself and had opinions about everything, which she delivered with warm authority and an endless supply of corn tortillas. Doña Esperanza came by twice a week, sometimes more, and she and Alma would sit at the kitchen table and drink coffee and talk about the practical business of survival, and occasionally about loneliness, which both women acknowledged without ever making it the center of the conversation. "You are too young to stay buried with Daniel," Doña Esperanza told her one morning in April, 6 months after Daniel's death. She said it matter-of-factly, the way she said most things, as though she were stating a feature of the landscape. "I am not buried with anyone," Alma said, and she said it without defensiveness because she knew it was true. "I am very much alive and I have 11 cattle to prove it." Doña Esperanza laughed, a round and generous sound. "Yes, but 11 cattle are not good conversation." Alma smiled into her coffee. "They are not." She did not think much more about it, because the work of spring did not allow for extended contemplation of one's personal circumstances. There was a section of the south fence that had been pushed over, likely by a wandering bull from somewhere up the valley, and she spent 3 days repairing it. There was the kitchen garden to turn and plant. There was a section of the barn roof where the shingles had begun to lift and curl, and she climbed up there herself one clear afternoon with a pry bar and a bundle of new cedar shingles she had purchased in town, and she replaced the damaged ones before the rainy season could do its worst. It was while she was up on that roof, sometime in the middle of May, that she first saw Timothy Morgan. He was riding along the road that passed a quarter-mile from her property, and he was not alone. He had 2 ranch hands with him, and they were trailing a small string of horses, 5 or 6 animals moving with the loose-limbed ease of creatures that had been traveling a distance. Even from the barn roof, Alma could see that the man at the head of the string rode with a particular kind of easy authority, the way a man rides when he is thoroughly at home in the saddle and has been since childhood. He wore a dark hat with a wide brim that was sun-faded at the crown, and a gray shirt, and he sat his horse the way the land itself seemed to sit, steady and unconcerned. Alma watched them pass with the detached curiosity of someone who lives alone and notices things simply because there is no one else to notice them. Then she went back to her shingles. She did not learn who he was until she drove into Caldera 2 days later to pick up a sack of flour and a new length of rope from Pierce's store. Mabel Pierce, who ran the store with her husband Gerald, and who was the most reliable source of local information in the county, told her without being asked. "You heard about the Morgan Ranch," Mabel said, wrapping Alma's flour in brown paper. "I have not," Alma said. "Timothy Morgan bought the old Hargrove spread," Mabel said. 40 acres bigger than yours up along the north end of the valley. He came down from Colorado. Word is he ran a good operation up there but wanted more room. He has got horses and cattle both, and they say he is a fair man." She paused, which in Mabel Pierce's conversational style was a signal that something additional was coming. "He is not married." "That is interesting news about the land," Alma said pleasantly, and she collected her flour and her rope and drove her wagon home. She did think about it a little. She could not pretend she did not. A new neighbor in the valley was a significant thing. New neighbors affected water rights and grazing boundaries and the general texture of life in a place where people were spread thin across the land. She filed the information away with the practical part of her mind and thought about it in the same spirit she thought about the condition of the south fence or the likelihood of summer rain. What she did not anticipate was that he would come to her. It happened on a Thursday morning in late May, clear and warm, when Alma was in the barn working on the gray gelding's left front shoe. The gelding, whose name was Ghost, had pulled a shoe the previous afternoon, and Alma had removed the bent remaining nails and was preparing to tack on the replacement she had shaped at the small forge in the corner of the barn, which Daniel had installed, and which Alma had learned to use after a season of expensive trips to the farrier in town. She had Ghost's leg lifted and braced on her knee, and she was focused on the work, her hair pinned back under a cotton cloth, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, when she heard hooves in the yard. She set Ghost's hoof down gently, straightened her back with a small wince at the protest from her shoulders, and walked to the barn door. Timothy Morgan sat on a tall bay horse in her yard. He was younger than she had expected from the easy authority of his riding, not yet 40 she thought, with a sun-browned face and dark eyes and the kind of jaw that looked like it had been carved with patience. He took his hat off when he saw her, which she noted, because not all men remembered to do that. "Good morning," he said. "I am looking for the Redmond homestead. I was told this was it." "It is," Alma said. "I am Alma Redmond." Timothy Morgan, he held the hat against his chest for a moment. "I have taken the Hargrove place to the north. I wanted to come and pay my respects to the neighbors." He paused. "I heard about your husband. I am sorry for your loss." "Thank you," Alma said. She had gotten reasonably good at accepting condolences without the words snagging on something inside her chest, though they sometimes still did. "Would you like to come down and have coffee? I was in the middle of shoeing my gelding, but I can break." "I do not want to interrupt your work," he said, and he said it in a way that suggested he meant it, which she also noted. "You are not interrupting," she said. "I have been at it since dawn and my back is grateful for the excuse." He swung down from the bay with the ease of long practice and tied the horse to the post near the water trough. He followed her toward the house, and as they passed the open barn door he slowed just slightly. She saw him looking at the western wall, at Daniel's tools hanging in their perfect, ordered rows. He stopped walking. She watched him look at the tools the way a person looks at something that surprises them into attention. His eyes moved along the wall from left to right, taking in the graduated hammers, the saws, the chisels in their rack, the coils of rope with their tucked tails, the draw knife and the spoke shave, and the small set of farrier's rasps that she had recently added to the collection. "These are yours," he said. "They were my husband's," she said. "They are mine now." He looked at the wall for another moment, and then he looked at her, and there was something in his expression that was not pity, which she was accustomed to receiving, but something closer to recognition or respect. "I have been running ranches for 15 years, he said quietly. "I have had hired men and foremen and partners. I have never seen a tool wall kept this well." Daniel believed that a well-kept tool was a well-used tool, Alma said. He was right. Timothy Morgan turned from the wall and looked at her directly, and there was a frankness in the look that she found disarming without being intrusive. "You do this yourself. The shoeing, the tools, all of it." "There is no one else to do it," she said simply. He shook his head, but not dismissively. He said, with a quiet certainty that landed in the space between them without any self-consciousness at all, "Mrs. Redmond, you are the most capable person I have met since I came to this valley." She looked at him for a moment. She was not a woman easily flattered or easily moved by flattery, but that was not what this had been. He had said it the way a man states a fact he has personally observed, and that was different. "Come inside," she said. "I will make coffee." The coffee was strong and dark the way she made it, the way she preferred it, and she set out the last of a pan of cornbread that Doña Esperanza had brought 2 days ago, and they sat at the kitchen table and talked about the valley with the frank, practical attention of two people for whom the land was the central fact of existence. He told her about his operation in Colorado, which had been a horse ranch primarily, breeding and selling working stock to the army and to cattle operations. He had done well enough, but the range was getting crowded, and he had heard about the valley in New Mexico from a friend who had passed through the previous year. The Hargrove place had come available at what he considered a fair price, and he had bought it without seeing it in person, which he now considered either brave or foolish. He was not yet sure which. "It is good land," Alma said. "The water is reliable, which is more than you can say for half the territory. The winters are cold but not killing. The summers are dry, but there is enough rain if you do not overgraze." "Have people overgrazed?" "Hargrove did," she said plainly. "He ran too many cattle for his acreage and he burned off the grass. It will recover. Give it 2 seasons and do not push it and it will come back." He looked at her with that direct, attentive regard again. "You know this range?" "I have lived here for 3 years," she said. "Daniel and I came out from Missouri in '76. He had been here before, scouted it, and he chose well." She paused. "He chose most things well." There was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable. She poured more coffee without asking if he wanted it, because his cup was empty, and he was clearly a man who drank coffee with the same serious application he appeared to bring to most things. "I hope you will not mind a neighbor who may need to ask questions," he said. "You clearly know more about this land than I do, and I am not too proud to admit that." "I do not mind," she said. And she found, with a small private surprise, that she meant it. He stayed perhaps an hour. When he left, he settled his hat on his head and thanked her for the coffee in a way that managed to be both formal and warm, which was a combination she had not often encountered, and he rode north along the road with that same easy, settled posture she had noticed from the barn roof. She went back to the barn and finished shoeing Ghost, and she thought about the tool wall comment while she worked. turning it over the way she turned a horseshoe before driving the nails, checking the angle and the fit. He had not said it to be charming. He had said it because the tool wall had told him something, and he had been honest about what it told him. She respected that. She had respected very little about the interactions she had had with men since Daniel died, most of which had been either pitying or subtly predatory, the latter being men who looked at a woman alone on 40 acres and saw an opportunity rather than a person. Timothy Morgan had looked at her tools and seen a person. She finished the shoe and set Ghost's hoof down and straightened up and rolled her sleeves back down and decided to think about it no further, because there were cattle to check and a kitchen garden that needed attention and approximately 40 other things that demanded doing before the day was over. But she thought about it anyway, in the small moments between tasks, the way a song gets into your head and plays itself quietly under everything else. He came back the following Thursday, which she did not expect, and the Thursday after that, which she began to understand was a pattern. He always came in the morning, always on horseback alone, and he always had a practical question that served as the stated reason for the visit, even as both of them began to understand that the practical questions were not the only reason. The first time he asked about the water rights along the north boundary of the valley, which was genuinely complicated, and involved a document that Alma located in Daniel's papers and spread on the kitchen table so they could read it together. The second time he asked about the quality of the hay from the eastern meadow, because he was thinking of cutting a deal with old Hannigan, who ran a small operation 2 valleys over, and Alma had done business with Hannigan and could tell him that the man was honest but slow to pay, which was useful intelligence. They talked about cattle and land and weather and water with the intense, absorbed pleasure of 2 people who genuinely loved the work of the land. And sometimes they talked about other things, about the territory and its politics, about the injustice of the way the federal government was handling the Apache situation, which both of them felt with a particular anger. The Apache people had been living on this land for generations before any white settler had ever seen it, and the treatment they were receiving from the army and from the government was a disgrace that neither Alma nor Timothy could talk about without feeling the weight of it. Alma had known an Apache woman in town, a dignified and quiet person named Naya who had sold beadwork and who had been moved off her land 2 years before by a land order that Alma still considered one of the ugliest things she had witnessed, and she said so plainly. Timothy listened to her say it, and he nodded with a gravity that told her he had thought about it himself. "The land was not empty when we came to it," he said. "That is a truth that gets told around in whispers when it ought to be said out loud." "Yes," she said, "it ought to be." These conversations made her feel less alone in a way that the practical exchanges did not, because finding someone who would sit across a kitchen table and acknowledge an inconvenient truth with you was rarer and more valuable than finding someone who could help with the water rights. She noticed other things about him. He was precise in his language, not flashy, not given to the kind of exaggerated speech that some men used to fill the air, but he chose his words with obvious care, and she found this appealing in the way that she found the tool wall appealing, as evidence of a kind of interior discipline. He had a dry, quiet humor that surfaced occasionally in the form of a single understated observation delivered with a perfectly straight face, and the first time she laughed at one of these, she saw something flash briefly in his expression, a pleasure that he quickly reined in, but not before she had seen it. He had been hurt, she thought. Not the way Daniel had been hurt by the snake, not in the body, but in some other way that had taught him to hold his pleasures carefully, to not let them run ahead of him. She recognized this because she did it herself. It was Doña Esperanza who put it plainly, as she put most things. "That rancher has been here 4 times, she said one morning, sitting at Alma's kitchen table with her coffee and looking at Alma with an expression of mild satisfaction, the way a person looks at a puzzle that is solving itself. "And you look different since he started coming. I look the same as I always do, Alma said. You look like a woman who has something to look forward to on Thursdays, Doña Esperanza said, which is different. Alma opened her mouth to say something dismissive and then closed it again because Doña Esperanza was rarely wrong about the things she noticed. He is a good man, Alma said finally. I think he is anyway. He is not Daniel. No one is Daniel, Doña Esperanza said gently. Daniel is gone, Alma. He has been gone for 7 months and he would be furious at you for letting his tools gather dust. His tools are not gathering dust, Alma said a little sharply. No, Doña Esperanza said. They are not, and neither are you. That is what I am telling you. June came in hot and dry, and Timothy arrived on a Thursday morning when Alma was dealing with a problem with one of the cattle, a young steer who had gotten through a gap in the fence, and was standing at the bottom of the rocky slope behind the barn looking both stubborn and frightened. She had been trying to ease it back up the slope for 20 minutes with limited success. When Timothy rode into the yard and took in the situation at a glance, he dismounted without being asked, tied his horse quickly, and came around to the far side of the slope to cut off the steer's escape route. Between the two of them, they had the animal back through the gap and the gap temporarily patched within half an hour. That fence needs work, Timothy said, examining the damaged section. I know it, Alma said. She pushed a loose strand of hair back from her face and looked at the fence with the mild frustration of a person who has too many tasks and only the hours of daylight to accomplish them in. I have a list. It is on the list. Can I help? He said. She looked at him. The offer was simple and unencumbered. He was not performing helpfulness or trying to position himself as indispensable. He was simply offering an extra pair of hands the way a neighbor does. I would appreciate that, she said. They spent the morning repairing a 30-foot section of fence together. He was good at the work, she observed, not showy about it, not trying to take over or to demonstrate anything, just steady and efficient and content to work in a rhythm alongside her without constant talk. She found this deeply comfortable. Daniel had been like that too, a good working companion who understood that silence during physical labor was not emptiness, but a kind of conversation in itself. At noon she made them both lunch, cold biscuits and sliced salt pork and coffee, and they ate it sitting on the porch with the shade falling across the planks and the cattle moving slowly in the far pasture and the whole valley lying quiet and sunlit around them. You know, Timothy said, breaking a biscuit in half with a contemplative expression, I have been thinking about something you said a few weeks ago, about not overgrazing the Hargrove land. What about it? I have been looking at the North Meadow. There is a seasonal stream that goes dry by August. Daniel, your husband, did he have a solution for that? A way to hold the water longer? Alma looked out at the pasture. He was planning to dig a stock pond. We never got to it. She paused. The place to dig it is about 200 yards north of the old Hargrove line on your property actually. There is a natural low in the ground there that would hold water beautifully if it were properly shaped. Daniel pointed it out to me once when we rode up that way. Timothy looked at her steadily. Would you show me where? She looked back at him. The afternoon stretched ahead, warm and unhurried, and the fence was repaired and the steer was safely where he belonged. Yes, she said. Get your horse. They rode north together along the fence line, out through the gap in the terrain where the valley narrowed between two rocky rises, and across the invisible line between her property and his. The land here was rougher, more varied, the grass shorter and thinner from the Hargrove years of overuse but already beginning, she was glad to see, to show signs of the recovery she had predicted. She could see faint new green pushing up through the dry bleached stems. She took him to the place Daniel had shown her, a broad, subtle depression in the land that looked from a distance like nothing particular but which, when you rode down into it, revealed itself as a natural basin rimmed on 3 sides by gentle slopes. The seasonal stream ran along the northern edge. There, she said, pointing to the deepest part of the depression. If you dig a basin here, 6 or 8 feet deep, and build a small earthen dam across that northern gap, You will hold enough water to carry your stock through August." Timothy sat his horse and looked at the ground with the focused attention of a man who is already seeing what is not yet there. His jaw was set in a thoughtful line and his eyes moved carefully across the terrain the way they moved when he was working something out. "You have a good eye for land," he said. "Daniel had a good eye," she said. "He taught me." "He taught you well." Timothy turned his horse slowly, looking at the whole basin. Then he looked at her, and there was something in his face that was different from the polite respect she had seen in the kitchen or by the fence. It was something warmer and less guarded, and it appeared before he could quite pull it back. "And you learned well, Mrs. Redmond. Not everyone who is taught a thing actually learns it." She felt a warmth rise in her chest that she did not try to name. The sun was high and white above the valley, and the dry air smelled of dust and sage and the faint sweetness of the recovering grass. And she was sitting on Copper's back with a rancher she had known for 6 weeks, looking at a hollow in the ground and feeling, for the first time since Daniel died, something that was not grief or duty or simple survival. She turned her horse homeward before she could examine the feeling too closely. There were more Thursdays. There were other days too, increasingly, when Timothy appeared not on the pretense of a question, but simply because he was riding past, or because he had been in town, and had brought something from Pierce's store that she had mentioned needing. He brought her a new awl one morning because she had said in passing that hers had broken. He brought it wrapped in paper, and handed it to her with the slightly self-conscious directness of a man who is not practiced at small gifts and is not sure of their reception. She unwrapped it and examined the blade and the handle and said, "This is a good one," with a pleasure that was entirely genuine. He said Gerald Pierce said it was the best he had, and he watched her with those dark eyes that were good at staying still while the rest of him was thinking hard. She put the awl in its place on the tool wall, in the fitted rack alongside the other awls, handle turned the same direction as the rest. She saw him watching her do it. "You keep it exactly the way he had it," Timothy said. Not a question, not a criticism, just an observation, the way he observed most things. "He was right about the system," she said. "Being right about something does not stop being true because the person who was right is gone." A silence settled between them. Outside the barn, the June afternoon hummed with insect sound, and somewhere in the distance, a mockingbird was cycling through its repertoire. "Mrs. Redmond," he said, and then he stopped. She turned from the tool wall and looked at him. He was standing in the middle of the barn with his hat in his hands, which she noticed because he had not yet taken his hat off today, had ridden in still wearing it, and now he was holding it between his hands and turning it slowly in a circle the way men sometimes do when they are working up to something. "I think you know," he said carefully, "that I have been coming here more often than the water rights required." "I had noticed," she said. "I want you to know that I have enormous respect for you," he said. "That is not flattery. I mean it as a plain statement. I have seen what you do here, how you run this place, how you think about it. You are serious about your work and honest in your opinions, and you do not waste time or words, and those are qualities I admire above most others." She was quiet, watching him. "I also," he paused. The hat went around another half-turn. "I also enjoy your company more than I have enjoyed anyone's company in a very long time, and I believe you may feel something similar, though I would not presume." She did not look away from him. She was not the kind of woman who managed difficult moments by looking at the floor. "What is it you want to say, Mr. Morgan?" she said. She did not say it coldly. She said it with the directness she applied to everything else. He met her eyes. "I would like to know if you would permit me to court you," he said. "Formally, with the understanding that I am not in a hurry and I would never ask you to diminish your grief or your loyalty to Daniel, and that I am a patient man." The mockingbird outside hit a particularly complicated sequence, and then fell briefly silent. Alma Redmond stood in her barn next to her late husband's perfectly ordered tools and looked at the man who had seen those tools and called her the most capable person he had ever met, and she thought about what Doña Esperanza had said about not being buried. "Daniel would have liked you," she said finally. "He had good judgment about people." Timothy was very still. "Yes," she said, "you may court me." The hat stopped turning. Something shifted in Timothy Morgan's face, not dramatically, not with any performance, but in the way that a held breath releases, quietly and with relief. "Thank you," he said. And then, with the faint, careful smile of a man who does not use smiles as currency and therefore spends them with intention, "I will try to be worthy of the compliment about Daniel's judgment." Doña Esperanza was, predictably, delighted. "I told you," she said the next morning, arriving at the door with tortillas and the expression of a woman who has been proven correct about something she already knew. "You did tell me," Alma said, opening the door wide. "Come in and be gracious about it." "I am always gracious," Doña Esperanza said, sweeping inside, and both of them laughed. The courtship was conducted with a careful, mutual propriety that suited both parties. Timothy did not rush. He came 3 times a week now rather than once, and they fell into a pattern that had the easy familiarity of something that had always been happening, with the quiet excitement of something new. They rode together in the evenings when the day's heat had begun to flatten out and the light went gold across the valley. They worked alongside each other on whatever project the day demanded, because neither of them knew how to be idle and neither of them wanted to be. They talked endlessly, easily, about everything. She learned things about him in pieces, the way you learn the topography of land you are walking across carefully. He had grown up in Ohio, had come west at 19 with an uncle who ran a horse operation in Colorado and had never gone back east. He had been married once before, briefly in his mid-20s, to a woman who had found the isolation of ranch life insupportable and had eventually returned to her family in Denver. There had been no children. He did not speak about it with bitterness, but with a sorrow that was old and settled, the way all old sorrows eventually settle into the architecture of a person. "I do not think she was wrong to go," he said one evening as they sat by the stock pond he was in the process of digging, resting on the bank with the late light coming level across the new grass. "We wanted different things. I wanted to be here in this country doing this work. She wanted to be somewhere else, closer to people, closer to comforts. Neither of us was wrong. We were just wrong for each other." "That is a generous way to see it," Alma said. "It is the accurate way," he said. "I am not generous for its own sake. I am accurate." She smiled at that because it was true and she knew it about him already. She told him about Daniel, which was harder but which she did willingly because she did not believe in keeping the important pieces of yourself locked away out of some misplaced protective instinct. She told him about meeting Daniel in Missouri, both of them at a church social, and about how he had been the only person there who had talked to her about farming rather than dancing, which had convinced her immediately that he was worth knowing. She told him about the journey west, which had been hard and beautiful in equal measure. She told him about the first winter, when they had nearly lost the cattle and Daniel had spent 2 nights in the barn keeping the animals warm by lamplight, and she had brought him food and coffee at midnight and at 3 in the morning, and they had sat together in the cold barn wrapped in blankets, talking quietly about everything and nothing. "He sounds like a man worth grieving," Timothy said. "He was," she said. "He is." "That is not a thing I would ask you to stop doing," Timothy said. "Grieving him. I want you to understand that." She looked at him in the evening light, at the honest and careful face of this man who had ridden into her yard with a practical question, and had looked at her tool wall and seen something real. "I know you would not," she said. July arrived and brought with it a heat that lay across the valley like a heavy hand, and a situation that disrupted the gentle rhythm of the courtship with the sudden, clarifying force of a crisis. One of Timothy's ranch hands, a young man named Pete Dawes, who was perhaps 20 and earnest to the point of occasional recklessness, was riding fence on the eastern boundary when his horse threw him against the rocky ground, and he came back to the Morgan ranch semi-conscious with his left arm held at an angle that told everyone immediately that it was badly broken. The nearest doctor was in Caldera, 18 miles away, and the road was rough, and the afternoon was already old. Timothy came to Alma first, riding hard, because he had seen the splinted arm she kept in the barn and knew she had some experience with field medicine, a necessity for anyone running a ranch without neighbors nearby. She was already moving by the time he had half explained, going to the barn for her medical supplies, the splinting materials and the clean rags, and the small bottle of laudanum she kept for emergencies. She told him what she was bringing and what she needed him to have ready, and he turned his horse without a wasted word and rode back ahead of her. When she arrived at the Morgan Ranch, which she had not yet seen up close, her first impression was of a place in the process of becoming itself. The main house was solid but new, the wood still bright, the porch posts not yet weathered to gray. There were two smaller structures that served as bunkhouses, and a large barn that was further along in its construction than the house. The yard was clean and purposefully laid out, the water trough in the right place, the wood pile properly positioned to catch the afternoon shade. Pete Dawes was lying on a bunk in the first bunkhouse, pale and sweating, trying not to make noise and only partially succeeding. Timothy was with him, and the other hand, an older man named Hector who had the composed expression of someone who has seen worse and lived through it. Alma set down her bag and looked at the arm. She had done this before, set a break, when Daniel had snapped 2 fingers on his right hand with a falling timber and the doctor had been unavailable. These breaks were worse, the forearm in 2 places by her reed, but the skin was unbroken, which was the most important thing. She talked to Pete the entire time she worked, not chattering but low and even, the way Daniel had talked to frightened cattle, steady sound as an anchor. She told him what she was doing and what she needed from him, which was mostly to stay still and breathe, and she gave him a measured amount of the laudanum to take the worst edge off the pain. Timothy held the boy's shoulder as she positioned the arm, because she needed a second set of hands, and he provided them without flinching when Pete cried out at the worst moment of the setting. When it was done, and the arm was properly splinted and wrapped, and Pete was drifting toward the soft edges of the laudanum, Alma stood and rolled her sleeves back down and looked at her own hands for a moment. "He needs to be seen by a doctor," she said. "What I have done will hold him, but a physician should look at it." "I will take him in the wagon tomorrow morning," Timothy said. He was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately read, but which had intensity to it. "Good," she said. She picked up her bag. "Alma," he said. She turned. He almost never used her given name without the formal preface, and the sound of it alone caught her attention. "I do not know what I would have done without you tonight," he said. "You would have managed," she said. "You are not a man who does not manage." "Maybe," he said, "but I am glad you were here." She stayed long enough to drink a cup of coffee with him on the porch of the main house, while the stars came out one by one over the valley, and she looked at the land around his buildings, and saw it the way she saw all land, as a thing with particular personality, with strengths and vulnerabilities, and she thought about what it would be to know this land the way she knew her own 40 acres. She thought about other things too, sitting in the warm dark beside Timothy Morgan, listening to the quiet sound of the valley at night. She thought about how long she had been alone, and how she had convinced herself she was content with it, because content was not the same as happy, and happiness had started to seem like an excess, a luxury, something that belonged to an earlier version of herself, and not to the woman who drove nails and shoed horses and kept her late husband's tools in perfect order. She thought about the fact that happiness might not, after all, be entirely out of reach. In August, with the stock pond finished and holding water beautifully, and the south fence repaired and the kitchen garden producing a harvest she could barely keep up with, Timothy Morgan asked her if she would ride with him to the summer social in Caldera. This was, in 1879 New Mexico territory, a public statement of courtship, and both of them knew it. The Caldera summer social was held in the clearing behind the church, and it was the most well-attended community event of the year, when all the ranchers and homesteaders and townspeople gathered to eat and dance and catch up on the year's news, and who arrived with whom was noted by everyone and commented upon by most. "I want people to know that we are courting," Timothy said, simply and without drama, "if you are willing for them to know it." Alma thought about what Doña Esperanza would say if she turned this down, and then she thought about what she herself would feel, and those two answers were in agreement with each other. "I am willing," she said. They arrived at the social on a Saturday evening in August with the sunset going orange and red behind the mountains and the lights already strung between the trees in the clearing. Timothy drove her in his wagon because he had a better team than she did, and she wore her dark blue dress, the one that was not morning black, that she had bought in the spring with the vague sense that she might want it someday, and now wore with a definiteness of purpose that felt like something important. The reaction from the community was, as she had expected, immediate and varied. Mabel Pierce looked as though every prediction she had ever made had been simultaneously confirmed. Old Hannigan shook Timothy's hand and nodded at Alma with the specific approval of a man who likes to see things done correctly. Several women of Alma's approximate acquaintance came to speak with her, with expressions ranging from genuine warmth to barely concealed speculation. And Doña Esperanza, who had been invited as always and arrived every year in her best black dress with her hair pinned under a beautiful comb that had been her mother's, took one look at Alma and Timothy walking into the clearing together and pressed both of Alma's hands between her own and said, in Spanish and then in English for emphasis, "This is good. This is very good." They danced. Alma had not danced in a year and a half, not since a neighbor's wedding the summer before Daniel died, and the music from the fiddle player and the squeezebox player was rough and cheerful and insistent. Timothy danced the way he did everything else, with practical competence and without any pretense of elegance, and he held her with the correct distance and the correct firmness, and she found that the combination of the music and the warm air and his hand at her waist produced in her a kind of lightness that she had not expected to feel. After the third dance, he did not immediately seek another partner or step away to talk to the other ranchers, which she had half expected him to do. He stayed beside her and they talked with people together, and it had the quality of something practiced, something that fit naturally, the way a well-made joint fits without visible effort. On the way home in the wagon, the night fully settled and the stars enormous above the valley, they sat close enough that the sides of their shoulders were in contact and neither of them moved apart. "I am glad we came," she said. "So am I," he said. "Mabel Pierce will tell everyone in the county by Monday," she said. "She has probably already sent letters," he said, and Alma laughed, a full and unguarded laugh that rang out into the night air, and she felt him turn to look at her in the dark with an attention that was warm and complete. He reached over and took her hand where it lay on her knee and held it and did not say anything else, and she did not take it back. September came, cool and gold, and with it a problem that tested both of them. There was a man in the valley named Clifton Adder, who had been running a small operation on the western side of the valley for several years, and who had, in the past, made noises about the Redmond property that had always stopped short of direct action. He was a man of the type that Daniel had identified early and accurately as someone who would take what he could get away with taking, and who had been kept in check partly by Daniel's presence, and mostly by Alma's obvious competence and willingness to defend her property. With the news of the courtship spreading through the county, something in Adder's calculations apparently shifted, because in the first week of September he drove his cattle through Alma's south fence, the section she had just repaired, and had them grazing on her south pasture for the better part of 2 days before she noticed. She noticed because she rode fence every few days as a matter of habit, and when she found the breach she found it was not accidental. The fence posts had been pulled rather than broken, clean holes in the ground where the posts had stood, with none of the torn wire and splintered wood that a wandering herd produces. She patched it herself, working steadily and without panic, and then she rode to Caldera and filed a formal complaint with the county land office, which was a small and underfunded operation run by a man named Bellamy who was conscientious but had limited authority. She documented everything, the pulled posts, the grazing damage, the dates. She did this before she told Timothy. When she did tell him that same evening, riding to his place after stopping in Caldera, she told him what had happened and what she had already done about it, and she watched him carefully as she spoke. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "What do you need from me?" She appreciated this enormously. Not what should I do, not let me handle this, but what do you need? A witness would help, she said. Someone with standing in the county who can confirm the fence damage was deliberate. Bellamy will take it more seriously coming from you than from me alone. Then I will come with you to see Bellamy tomorrow, he said. Thank you, she said. They went together to Bellamy's office the next morning, and Timothy gave his account of what he had seen when he accompanied Alma to assess the damage, and Bellamy recorded it all carefully and sent a formal notice to Clifton Adder that evening. There were no further incursions. Adder did not come near Alma's property again, but the episode showed her something about Timothy Morgan that had been one of the things she needed to know, though she had not known she needed to know it until it was demonstrated. He had not ridden to Adder's property in righteous anger. He had not tried to manage the situation over her head. He had asked what she needed and then provided precisely that. He had treated her property and her complaint as belonging to her. You know, she said, riding home from Bellamy's office with the October sky going blue-violet at the edges, most men would have tried to handle it themselves. It is your land, he said, your problem to solve. Yes, she said, it is. He looked over at her from his horse. Did you think I would ride over there and start something? I thought you might want to, she said honestly. He considered this. I did want to, he said, briefly. The wanting passed when I thought about what you had already done. He paused. You had already handled it correctly. My wanting to additionally handle it was about me, not about you. I did not think that was a good enough reason. She looked at him riding beside her in the October light and felt the thing in her chest that she had been declining to name settle itself quietly into a name of its own. She was in love with him. She had been moving toward it for months, deliberately and with both eyes open, the way she did everything, and now she had arrived. She did not tell him immediately. She kept it for a few days, the way you keep something warm, cupped in both hands before you open them. She told him on a Thursday morning, which seemed fitting. He had come to help her move the cattle to the north pasture, a job that was easier with 2 riders, and afterward they were sitting on the porch with coffee, and he was telling her something about a horse he had bought the previous week, a young roan mare with tremendous potential, and a stubborn streak that he described with the fond exasperation of a man who respects an animal for having opinions. She waited for him to finish, and then she said without preamble, because preamble was not her style, Timothy, I love you. He went very still. I am not in a hurry, she said. I am not asking for anything immediate. But I thought you should know, because you have been honest with me and I owe you the same. He set his coffee down on the porch rail with great precision and turned to look at her fully. His eyes, those dark and careful eyes, had something in them that she had been watching build for months, something that had been held back by patience and restraint and maybe by the ghost of an old wound, and which now, with an audible feeling internal sound like the giving way of a held breath, released. Alma, he said, with a weight on her name that told her everything. I have loved you since the morning I watched you put that new awl in its place on the tool wall, and understood that you were the kind of person who does things right not because someone is watching but because it is right. She looked at him. The morning light was coming at a low angle across the porch and catching the side of his face, and she thought, not for the first time, that he was a beautiful man, not in the conventional decorative sense, but in the way that capable, honest, well-made things are beautiful. That was a long time to hold on to that, she said. I am a patient man, he said. I told you. You did tell me, she said. He reached across and cupped her face in his hand, careful and deliberate, the way he did everything, and she leaned into it. And when he kissed her, it was with the same quality of careful intention, not tentative but precise, as though he had been thinking about exactly this for a long time and had arrived at it with his whole attention. When they broke apart, the coffee was going cold, and neither of them cared in the slightest. October was the most beautiful month in the valley. Alma had known this since her first year there and loved it without reservation. The way the cottonwoods went gold along the watercourses, and the air gained a clarity that made the mountains look closer. And the mornings were cold now, in a clean and stimulating way that made you feel particularly alive. She rode copper in the early mornings with a sense of pleasure that was uncomplicated and complete, and she thought about the future with an openness she had not been able to manage since Daniel died, a future that had shape and texture and specific, wonderful details. Timothy asked her to marry him on the last Saturday of October in her barn, which she would later say was exactly the right place. He was not elaborate about it. He was not a man given to elaborate things. He stood near the tool wall with his hat in his hands. As he had stood that first time, he said something real to her, and he asked her with a directness and a seriousness that matched everything else about him. "Alma Redmond," he said, "I would like to spend the rest of my life doing this with you. All of it. The work and the weather and the hard years and the good ones. I would be honored beyond my ability to express if you would marry me." She looked at the tool wall beside him, at Daniel's hammers and saws and the new awl in its place, and she felt the two things exist in her at once, the love she had carried for Daniel and the love she had grown for this man, and she understood that they did not compete with each other, that a person's capacity for love was not a fixed amount to be divided but something that expanded to hold what it needed to hold. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He came to her, then the way a man comes towards something he has wanted with patience and arrived at with gratitude, and he put his arms around her, and she put her face against his shoulder, and they stood in the barn with the smell of hay and horses and oiled metal around them, and neither of them needed to say anything. They married in December, in the small church in Caldera on a cold, clear day when the sky was the particular hard blue of winter, and the mountains were white-capped and brilliant. It was a simple ceremony with Doña Esperanza in the front pew and Mabel Pierce, weeping happily 3 rows back, and old Hannigan sitting ramrod straight with his approval radiating from him like heat from a stove, and Pete Dawes in the back with his healed arm still slightly crooked, watching his employer marry the woman who had set that arm, with an expression of pure and uncomplicated happiness. Alma wore her dark blue dress, the one she had bought in the spring when she hadn't quite known why. She had added a piece of cream lace at the collar that Doña Esperanza had given her, old lace from Esperanza's own wedding, pressed and delicate. And she carried a spray of dried late-season wildflowers because there were no fresh ones in December in New Mexico territory, but she had gathered and pressed these in October, and they were exactly right. Timothy, in his best dark coat and a clean white shirt that she suspected Mabel Pierce had ironed for him, watched her walk down the aisle with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life. It was the expression of a man who cannot believe his luck and is not trying to hide that fact. After the ceremony, there was a gathering at Pierce's, with food contributed by half the town and music from the same fiddle player who had played the summer social. And Doña Esperanza danced with Hannigan, which surprised everyone including apparently both of them. And Pete Dawes danced with Mabel Pierce's eldest daughter, while Mabel watched with an expression of speculation that suggested she was already planning the next wedding. And Timothy and Alma danced together in the center of the floor, while the December dark came down outside the windows, and the lamplight made everything golden. "Mrs. Morgan," he said, quietly, against her hair. She thought about the sound of that name, the new weight of it, and beside it like a companion the memory of Mrs. Redmond, which she would not give up and which she did not have to, because both were true and both were hers. "Mr. Morgan," she said. They moved into the Morgan Ranch house together, which was larger than Alma's place and still not fully finished, which became a project for the winter months, the two of them working on the interior with the same companionable efficiency they brought to everything. Alma's tools came with her, The whole wall of them, every implement precisely as it had been, packed with care and rehung in the same order in the larger barn at the Morgan place. Timothy watched her hang them and did not suggest any modification to the system. "The right wall gets good morning light," he offered, and that was how they decided placement, and the tool wall went on the right wall of the barn where the morning light would find it. Alma's 40 acres they did not sell. She kept them because she had built them, and because the land was hers in a way that went deeper than legal title, and because a woman in 1879 who owned land owned something real in a world that was not inclined to give women real things. They ran it as an extension of the Morgan operation, the combined acreage giving them significantly more range and flexibility. Her 11 cattle joined Timothy's herd, and the expanded operation began to take on the shape of something genuinely substantial. She moved Copper and Ghost to the Morgan stable, and Timothy's roan mare, whose name turned out to be Red, regarded Ghost with immediate suspicion and Copper with cautious interest, which seemed about right for a horse with strong opinions. The winter was hard that year, harder than the previous two, with a deep freeze in January that killed 2 of the cattle and froze the pump for 3 days. They dealt with it together, working side by side through the worst of it, spelling each other through the cold nights when the livestock needed watching. Alma would wake at 2 in the morning and find Timothy already putting on his coat, and she would put on her own coat and go with him, and they would sit in the barn wrapped in blankets and talk the way she had sat with Daniel in the cold years before, and the parallel sat gently in her heart without pain. She told him about it one night, about the memory, about Daniel in the barn. He listened with his full attention. "Does it bother you," she asked, "that I still think about him?" "No," he said without hesitation. "You loved him well. That is a good thing about you, not a problem to manage." She reached across and found his hand in the cold dark. Spring arrived late but brilliant, and with it a piece of news that Alma had been fairly certain about for 3 weeks before she was certain enough to say it. She told Timothy on a morning in early April when the first real warmth had returned to the air, and the new grass was coming up green and urgent across the pastures that Daniel had once told her would be good land if treated well. She told him while they were standing at the stock pond, watching the water level that had held beautifully through the winter, the natural basin she had shown him in their early days having become exactly what she had predicted it would be. "I am going to have a child," she said. He turned from the pond and looked at her, and the expression that crossed his face was one of the most unguarded things she had ever seen on a human face, joy so large and sudden and undefended that it seemed to surprise him as much as anyone. He put his arms around her without speaking, which was exactly right, and she put her face against his chest and felt the solid reality of him, this man who had ridden into her yard and seen her tool wall and told her the truth of what he saw, and she felt the future the way you feel land that is yours, with all its weight and all its promise. The summer of 1880 passed in the warm and demanding way of summers on the ranch. Alma continued to work, more moderately than before as the months progressed, with Timothy navigating the fine line between appropriate attentiveness and the overprotectiveness that she had told him plainly she would not tolerate. He navigated it well mostly, with only occasional slips into hovering that she addressed with a single pointed look. Doña Esperanza came to stay in September, which Timothy accepted as a matter of course and which Alma was grateful for, because Esperanza had delivered more children than she could count in her years in the territory, and her presence was worth more than any amount of medical textbooks. On a Tuesday evening in late September, with the harvest moon rising enormous and orange over the mountains, and the valley full of the smell of ripening grass and cooling air, Alma's son was born. He was a solid, emphatic baby who announced himself to the world with a force that seemed to startle everyone in the room except Doña Esperanza, who merely nodded as though his arrival confirmed something she had already known. He had Timothy's dark eyes and Alma's square jaw, and a quantity of black hair that none of them had expected. Timothy held him with the carefully calibrated arms of a man doing something for the first time that he wants to get exactly right. He stood beside the bed where Alma lay, tired and ferociously alive, and he looked down at the child with an expression that had taken him completely apart and put him back together in some altered configuration. "What will we call him?" he said very quietly. Alma had thought about this. She had thought about it for months, turning names over the way she turned everything, checking the fit. "Daniel," she said. "Daniel Timothy Morgan." She watched his face as she said it. She had expected that it might be complicated, offering Daniel's name to their son, the echo of it in the house, and she had thought about it carefully and decided that it was not complicated at all. It was right. It was honest. It was the kind of truth that a person of good character does not hide from. Timothy's eyes were bright in the lamplight. "That is a good name," he said, with a fullness in his voice that said much more than the words. "It is," she said. "Come sit with us." He sat on the edge of the bed carefully, the baby in the crook of one arm, his other hand finding Alma's hand on the quilt. And outside the September night was clear and enormous, and the ranch stretched out in every direction across the valley that had been Redmond land and was now Morgan land and was, in the way that all land is eventually simply itself, just the valley, just the place where they lived. The months that followed were full in every sense, the fullness of a life that is being lived in all its dimensions at once. Daniel Timothy Morgan grew with the impatient energy of a healthy child, and by the following spring was conducting himself in the barn, with an interest in the horses that his father observed with barely concealed delight. Ghost, the gray gelding who had been somewhat suspicious of most humans, took an inexplicable shine to young Daniel, and would stand patient as a stone while the baby pulled at his mane, which Timothy regarded as a minor miracle of equine temperament. The ranch operation grew with an authority and direction that came from two people who were genuinely good at the work and genuinely in agreement about how it should be done, which was the rarest kind of partnership. They ran cattle and horses both now, the horse operation having expanded as Timothy brought in 2 additional breeding mares in the spring of 1880. Alma managed the breeding records and the financial accounts, which she did with the same meticulous order she brought to everything, and the ranch books were kept as precisely as the tool wall in the barn. They had occasional disagreements, because they were two people with strong opinions and clear ideas about right and wrong ways of doing things, and they argued with the same directness they brought to everything else, sometimes heatedly, always honestly, and always with the fundamental respect for each other's intelligence and judgment that was the foundation of everything between them. The arguments never lasted long because neither of them was interested in holding a position they had been shown was wrong just to save face, and both of them respected being shown a better way more than they valued being right. There was an evening in the summer of 1881 when they sat on the porch after dinner, and the valley was at its most magnificent, the light dying slow and golden across the grass and the mountains purple in the distance. And little Daniel was asleep inside, and the horses were quiet in the stable, and the cattle were settled in the far pasture, and Alma sat with her coffee and thought about the trajectory of the past 3 years. 3 years since Daniel Redmond had died, and she had driven the nail into the fence post with her grief and her hammer. 3 years since she had climbed onto the barn roof to replace the shingles alone. 3 years since she had sat in this valley and understood that she was going to keep going, because stopping was not a thing she knew how to do. She thought about the tool wall, which hung in the big barn now, the same order, the same careful arrangement, Daniel's hammers and the all that Timothy had given her and all the rest of it. A wall that told the story of 2 men and 1 woman and a piece of land in New Mexico territory. Timothy was beside her on the porch, his long legs stretched out, his coffee cup resting on his knee, looking at the mountains with the settled, content expression of a man who is exactly where he belongs. "What are you thinking?" he said without looking over, because he had learned to read her silences and could tell the difference between the ones that wanted quiet and the ones that wanted the question. "About how things turn out," she said. "How do they turn out?" She looked at him, at the side of his face in the evening light, at the 15 years of sun and work written in the lines beside his eye, at the mouth she knew now with a familiarity and a continuing delight that surprised her sometimes with its freshness. "Better than I would have dared to plan," she said. He turned to look at her, and his smile, quiet and warm and entirely for her, was the same smile she had watched him produce cautiously in the early months and freely now, the smile of a man who has found the place and the person where his careful nature can finally rest. "Yes," he said, "better than I would have planned." He reached over and took her hand, and they sat there, while the last of the light went out of the valley and the first stars appeared, and the ranch around them settled into the sounds of evening, and it was the kind of happiness that does not announce itself loudly, that simply exists like good land, solid and reliable and entirely real. In the autumn of 1882, when Daniel Timothy Morgan was 2 years old, and conducting himself about the ranch with the busy purposefulness of a small person who has discovered that everything is interesting, Alma discovered she was expecting again. She told Timothy on a morning while she was taking inventory of the tack room, and he was mending a bridle nearby, domestic and practical and exactly right. He looked up from the bridle and regarded her with that same expression of surprised, enormous joy that she was glad to see had not diminished from the first time. "How are you?" he said. "Very well," she said. "Tired in the mornings, but otherwise in excellent order." "Then so am I," he said, and went back to the bridle, and she saw him smiling at the leather work with the private, barely contained happiness of a man who has more than he expected and knows it. Doña Esperanza arrived again in the spring of 1883, this time with a new piece of advice about what to expect from a second delivery being generally faster than the first, which proved to be entirely correct. Alma's daughter was born on a morning in April when the apple trees Alma had planted the previous year were just coming into blossom, small and white-flowered and hopeful in the kitchen garden. They called her Rosa, for the way the light had looked when she arrived, pink and new and extraordinary, and for Doña Esperanza, who had wept openly at the birth and said it was because the child was beautiful, which was true but not the whole truth. Rosa Morgan grew into a person of focused intensity and excellent opinions, which surprised nobody who knew her parents. Daniel, as an older brother, demonstrated the full range of older brother behavior, alternating between devoted protectiveness and the casual authority of someone who had been there first, and Rosa endured this with the patience of someone building a case. The ranch grew into something significant. By 1884, the combined Morgan operation was one of the most respected in Caldera County, known for the quality of its working horses in particular, which Timothy bred with the same careful attention to character and conformation that he brought to everything. Buyers came from as far as Santa Fe to look at the Morgan stock. Alma managed the books and the records and the business correspondence with a precision that several buyers remarked upon, occasionally with the surprise of men who had not expected to find those capabilities in the woman who walked out of the ranch house to meet them. An expectation that Alma addressed with pleasantness, and a mild, pointed efficiency that generally conveyed the point without anyone having to say a word. Mabel Pierce said, at one of the regular community gatherings, that Alma Morgan had built more in 5 years than most people built in a lifetime. Alma said that she had built it with a good partner, which was true, and that her late husband had laid better foundations than she had sometimes given him credit for, which was also true, and which she said with the ease of a woman who carries her whole story without needing to hide any of it. The tool wall in the barn became a landmark of sorts, in the small specific way that things become landmarks within a family, within a place. The hired hands who came to work at the Morgan Ranch over the years were all introduced to it on their first day, not as a museum piece, not as something to admire from a distance, but as a working system they were expected to maintain. This is how you hang a saw. This is how you coil a rope. This is the system, and the system works, and the person who established it understood her work, and you would do well to understand it too. Pete Dawes, whose arm had healed with only a slight crook that he claimed gave his throwing arm a useful idiosyncratic spin, had become the Morgan Ranch's most reliable hand over the years, and he enforced the tool wall standards with the evangelical devotion of a convert. He married the daughter of a farmer from the next valley over in 1884 and lived in a small house on the Morgan property and was, as far as Alma could tell, entirely and uncomplicated happy, which she considered one of the better outcomes she had been associated with. Doña Esperanza continued to come, twice a week, and there were still mornings when she and Alma sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and talked about the practical business of living, and occasionally about the larger things, about the changes coming to the territory, about the injustices that continued even as the years passed, about the people who had been on this land before them, and who deserved to be remembered and acknowledged rather than papered over with convenient forgetting. These conversations happened around the kitchen table with the children at their feet or playing outside, and Alma felt them as one of the essential things, the kind of honest accounting that a person of conscience needs to do regularly, like checking the fence line or reading the water level in the stock pond. In the spring of 1885, Alma turned 37, and Timothy turned 39, and they celebrated with a dinner that Doña Esperanza organized without being asked, arriving on the Saturday closest to both their birthdays with food enough for a gathering and the expectation of one. Half the valley showed up, as half the valley generally did when Doña Esperanza issued an invitation, because her cooking was sufficient motivation and her company was additional incentive. It was an evening of the kind that Alma stored up against the harder ones, a warm evening with lanterns on the porch and children running in the yard, and the valley stretched out around the ranch in its settled spring beauty, and all the people who mattered, Doña Esperanza and Mabel Pierce and Old Hannigan and Pete Dawes and his wife Clara and a dozen others, all of them fed and talking and alive in the lamplight. Timothy found her at one point near the edge of the yard, a little apart from the gathering, where she had stepped to look at the stars that were just becoming visible. "Are you all right?" he said. "Very much so," she said. "I just wanted to look at it for a moment." He stood beside her and looked at it with her, the ranch and the people and the lit windows of the house they had built together into something real. 8 years ago, she said, thinking aloud, I was patching a fence alone and telling myself I was content. Were you? She considered this honestly because she was always honest. I was surviving well, she said. That is not the same thing as content. And content is not the same thing as this. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned against him, the solid, familiar warmth of him, and they stood there while the stars came out one by one, and the voices of the people they loved made a sound like the valley itself, full and various and entirely alive. "What is this?" he said, quiet and curious, asking her to name the thing. She thought about it with the care she had always given to naming things correctly. "Home," she said. "This is home." He pulled her a little closer, and they stood that way, in the dark and the starlight, while inside the lamplight glowed and the children were beginning to be gathered up by their respective parents. And little Daniel had fallen asleep against Pete Dawes' shoulder, and Rosa was telling someone something with the focused intensity that suggested she had a position and intended it to be heard. And the horses were quiet in the stable, and the cattle settled in the pastures, and the tool wall hung in the barn with every implement in its place. Hammers left to right, saws clean and oiled, ropes coiled with the tails tucked in, and everything exactly as it should be. In the years that came after, the years that gathered and turned and moved as years do in the sustained and fortunate life of two people who have chosen each other well. The Morgan Ranch became the kind of place that the valley told stories about in the way places earn stories, through the accumulated weight of things done right. The horses that Timothy bred were known across the territory for their temperament and soundness. The cattle that Alma managed were healthy and well kept on land that she had never once overgrazed, following the principle that Daniel Redmond had understood and that she had taken into herself and carried forward. Daniel Timothy Morgan grew up with the land in his hands and his father's patience and his mother's precision, and at 17, he was already a rancher in every important sense of the word, with opinions about grass management and water rights that were his own and well considered. Rosa Morgan grew up with opinions about everything, which was the accurate summation of her character, and she was at 16 already corresponding with a woman in Santa Fe who ran a school, and where that would lead was not yet clear, but was clearly going to lead somewhere emphatic, which seemed entirely right. Doña Esperanza, magnificent and indestructible in the way of women who have been formed by hard things and who have not let the hard things make them small, was in her late 60s and still arriving twice a week with tortillas and commentary. She had become, in the truest sense, family, and was referred to as such, and regarded herself as such. And the kitchen table where she and Alma had first talked about not being buried with the dead had held so many conversations by now that it had been replaced once, and was on its way to needing replacing again. On an evening in the autumn of 1887, Alma walked out to the barn alone after dinner, as she sometimes did, for the quiet of it, for the smell of hay and horses and the particular peace of the space. She lit the lantern and stood in its warm circle and looked at the tool wall the way she had looked at it 10,000 times in the years since Daniel Redmond had built it, and she saw in it the same thing she had always seen in it, the evidence of a man who had believed that how you kept your tools was how you kept your life, careful and ordered, and ready for the next thing the day demanded. She took down the hammer she used most often, the medium-weight one, third from the left, and turned it in her hand, feeling the familiar balance of it. Timothy came into the barn behind her. She had not heard him follow, but she was not surprised. He had a way of knowing when she had gone somewhere to think. "Everything all right," he said. "Everything is very all right," she said. She held up the hammer, the lantern light catching the worn wood of the handle, the clean face of the head. "I was just thinking about Daniel." He came to stand beside her. He looked at the tool wall with her. "He would have liked this ranch," Timothy said. "He would have loved it," she said. "He would have had opinions about the stock pond, and he would have been right about at least half of them. Only half. He was a good man," she said, "not a perfect one. Neither are you." "Neither are you," he said with the quiet, private smile. She hung the hammer back on its hook, precisely where it belonged, and turned to her husband, this good and patient man who had looked at her tool wall and told her the truth about what he saw. And she felt the whole of her life as a coherent thing, not a series of losses and survivals, but a continuous and living story in which every part belonged to every other part. He put his arms around her there in the barn, in the lantern light, and she put her face against the familiar warmth of his shoulder, and the horses shifted quietly in their stalls, and outside the autumn night was cool and clear, and the Morgan Ranch lay settled and alive in the valley that had been good land from the beginning, if you treated it right. "Come inside," he said, after a while. "Rosa has been waiting to tell you something for the past hour, and she is going to combust if she has to wait much longer." Alma laughed. "What is it?" "Something about Santa Fe," he said. "I think it is good news." She had the expression she gets with good news. They walked back to the house together through the cool dark, and the lamp was burning in the kitchen window, and the voices of their children carried out into the yard. And when Alma opened the door and stepped inside into the warmth and the light, Rosa turned from the table with the expression Timothy had described, brilliant and eager and entirely herself, ready to announce the next thing. And Alma Redmond Morgan, who had driven a nail into a fence post alone in her grief, who had climbed a barn roof alone to replace the shingles, who had kept every tool in its place, because right was right regardless of who was watching, who had opened her yard and her kitchen table, and eventually her heart to the man who had seen her clearly and loved what he saw, sat down at her kitchen table in the warm lamplight of her full and living life, and listened.